The year 332 BC. The place, an island city named Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. The man, it's him, Alexander the Great. This would be the first documented case of siege weapons being used to do just that, siege. This is such a surreal sight to see, so how did this come to be? What brought about the common practice of using mechanized weapons to lay siege to walled cities? First, I want to get a few things out of the way, a little housekeeping, a little defining of terms. You see, when I say catapult, most people think of something like this. Now, that is a catapult, but when we're talking about the word catapult, it comes from a conjunction of two Greek words. The first word being kata, which means downward or just down, and pullein, which means to hurl. Kata pullein, to hurl downward. Kata pullein would evolve to the modern English word catapult. So that word is a verb, to hurl downward. It would eventually become a noun to describe any mechanized device to hurl something downward. Now, a catapult, as I said, is a mechanized device that hurls something down. It's not just a tool, like a bow or a sling. So that means a ballista is a catapult, a trebuchet is a catapult, and the one-armed torsion catapult that everyone thinks of, an onager, is also a catapult. Another thing I want to establish about our story is about human imagination. You see, we humans are very short-sighted. We don't look too far in the future, and that'll oftentimes cause us to reinvent the wheel, albeit a more complicated wheel, but it's still just a wheel. However, there are few crucial moments in human history where the imagination will create a new paradigm, as you will see in our story. One last thing I want to get out of the way before we start is I need to steal a quote from my favorite fan of history, Dan Carlin. He always says he's a fan of history, not a historian, and I agree with him. I too am not a historian. I don't play one on the internet. I am just a fan of history, and specifically, siege weapons. Without further ado, we shall begin our story. We begin in Syracuse, around 410 BC. Remember now, time goes backwards in BC. 410 is before 409. The city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily was in a very lucrative position for trade. This meant a lot of people wanted to control it. It's on an island just south of Italy. The king is Dionysius. He has been appointed dictator in order to deal with the Carthaginians that have been taking over his island. This was common practice back then. You would appoint one man to make decisive decisions in order to defeat a foe, but oftentimes problems would arise when it comes time for the dictator to relinquish power and give up his throne. Now, Dionysius is a very tricky man, and I don't want to go too far into his life, because that's not where our story lies. But I do want to tell a story of his trickery. Back in those days, people didn't fight wars year-round. Troops are needed for war, but they're also needed to harvest fields. This meant wars were usually fought from spring, after the seed was planted, until it came time to harvest those crops. Now, Dionysius would take advantage of this. You see, Dionysius had a lot of money. It was about the only thing he had. He used that money in order to hire mercenaries. Dionysius would command these mercenaries to go find troops harvesting their fields. These mercenaries would break into those men's houses and steal their weapons so they couldn't retaliate against Dionysius. This would cause these men on Sicily to question their loyalty to Carthage. The people that once supported Carthage now realized Dionysius had all the weapons and would flip loyalty to Syracuse. This will be very important to our story, as you will see next. Now, as I already said, Dionysius had a lot of money. He would use this money for many things. One was the mercenaries. Two, he would offer great wages for any skilled craftsmen to come build things on his island. And another thing, he would also pay for research and development of new weaponry. As a result, this meant Syracuse saw a lot of sieges. Sieges at this time were quite lame. You see, they didn't have siege weapons. They used stupid ladders and battering rams to try to scale the walls or knock them over. This made walled cities very hard to take. Syracuse had quite the walls. This meant it required a lot more people to attack a city than it did to defend a city. In a little tale of historical irony, Syracuse had just repelled a giant Athenian invasion force in the Mediterranean Sea, sinking nearly 200 ships. All this did was allow Carthage to have more control over the Mediterranean Sea with their powerful navy. Carthage basically had complete control of the island of Sicily, except for one main thorn in their side, Syracuse. Dionysius knew he couldn't muster the manpower in order to fight Carthage in a land war, or a traditional war at least. So he used what he did have, his money and his skilled laborers and craftsmen. Now, the historian Diodorus wrote a lot about this time period, and I would like to read you a quote. This quote is Diodorus speaking about Dionysius. He, being Dionysius, gathered skilled artisans, commandeering them from the cities under his control and attracting them by high wages from Italy and Greece and Carthaginian territory. His intention was to make weapons in great number and of every kind. After assembling many skilled workers, he divided them into groups in accordance with their skills and appointed over them most prominent citizens, offering great rewards to any who created a supply of arms. He distributed amongst them examples of each kind of armor, because he had gathered his mercenaries from many nations. For he was eager to have every one of his soldiers armed with the weapons of his own people, thinking that by such armor his army would, for this very reason, cause great concertation, and that in battle all of his soldiers would fight to the best of their effort and effect of their armor and weapons. Now, Diodorus talks about a few other arms and armaments that he's going to be building on the island, but we're going to skip to the part we care about. Now, this is Diodorus speaking again. In fact, the catapult was invented at this time in Syracuse, since the best artisans had been gathered from everywhere into one place. The high wages, as well as the numerous prizes offered to the workers who were judged the best, stimulated their zeal. In addition, over and above these factors, Dionysius circulated daily amongst the workers, talked with them in kindly fashion, and rewarded the most committed with gifts and invitations to his table. I think modern CEOs could learn something from this man. So as you can see, that quote was saying, basically, Dionysius offered to create a melting pot of ideas and tons of skilled laborers working freely in order to create better and new weapons. One of those weapons, Diodorus said, was the catapult. Human innovation comes when it's needed most, and Dionysius needed innovation if he was going to beat Carthage. But as stated previously, a lack of imagination meant the weapon wasn't too revolutionary. The bow and arrow was very commonplace. It was used for offense, defense, in the field. It was used all around. However, bows had a strict limit, that limit being the strength of the archer. Men could only draw a bow so far back, and with so much weight. This limited the range and the effect of the missile it shot. In order to surpass this human limitation, mechanized means were needed. And this is where, in 399 BC, in the island of Sicily, the city of Syracuse, the catapult was invented. Now, this event is well documented for the time, but, strangely enough, no one man or group is credited for creating the catapult. So we don't know who exactly made the catapult, but it was invented here. And now, this is the first catapult. Now, I hear you. I know what you're thinking. That's not a catapult. That's just a crossbow with a mental disorder. Well, you're right about the crossbow part, but that is a catapult. You might not like it, but this is what peak engineering looks like. Remember the defining of terms we did? What a catapult is? A mechanized device to hurl things downward? Well, that's what this does. You see, the point of engineering is to improve on limitations that have been reached. And the core principles of archery are to shoot an arrow as fast as possible, as far as possible, and theoretically with a flat trajectory so that the archer can easily aim. You see, at this time, bows were already reaching their limits. Archers can only pull back so much weight. This device, called the gastrophetus, is an improvement on all things bow and arrow. What this device does is mechanizes the bow. The little horseshoe you see at the back would be placed on the belly of the archer, and the little slide would be pushed into a wall or on the ground, drawing it backwards using the archer's weight and not just their arm. The little ratcheting system on it would go back and lock the bow in place at full draw, allowing the archer to hold it at full draw for as long as he wished. Then, simply pull the trigger and the arrow is released. This allowed for more draw weight, bigger arrows to be shot, flatter trajectory, and just an all-around improvement. The only drawback, it was heavy and hard to produce. This bow is often called the belly bow in modern day because of the little mechanism being used on the belly of the archer to draw it back. But there's kind of arguments on whether it's called the belly bow because they use the belly to draw it, or because this thing is shaped like a belly. I think it's because they used the belly to draw it back. Now, Dionysius had been amassing power and new technology in his little city of Syracuse. Dionysius would use this newfound invention and his large mercenary army mentioned before to take the fight to Carthage and take back his island. So there are many things that happened when Dionysius took the fight back to Carthage, but the one I want to cover is the siege of Mattia. All the way on the other side of the island is Mattia. Dionysius had taken the whole island and was already sieging Carthage's last settlement, well, one of their last settlements. And the point we most care about is how the belly bow, the first catapult, was used at the siege. Being heavy, it was hard for troops to carry them and use them in the field, so they were oftentimes mounted to siege towers. Now, siege towers back then were a lot smaller and were basically just glorified armored ladders. And with belly bows mounted to them, it allowed them to approach the walls with a lot greater ease. Given the belly bow's mechanized nature, it allowed the archers in the siege towers to greatly outrange the archers on the walls. In addition to siege towers, Dionysius would use boats to siege Mattia, since it was located on the sea. Now, the evidence of belly bows being used at the siege comes from one quote, from Diodorus. I'm going to read in part that quote, not the whole thing, it's kind of long, and I'm going to give it a loose translation so that I don't have to add any additional terms. Alright, I know we're quoting Diodorus again, but he's one of the few people whose texts survive about this time period. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt, since our sources, they're limited. Himilcon, the Carthaginian admiral, attacked the first ships, but was restrained by a multitude of missiles, for Dionysius had manned the ships with a great number of archers and slingers. The Syracusans slew many of the enemy from land by using the catapult to cast sharps. Indeed, this weapon caused great dismay because it was new. As a result, Himilcon was unable to achieve his plan and sailed away to Libya, believing that the sea battle would serve no end, since the enemy's ships were double in number. Diodorus doesn't explicitly say about belly bows and siege towers, but we have evidence that arrows were stocked in these siege towers, and the arrows were too large for the regular bow, so they must have been fired by the belly bow. Now, we could end the story here, but I have a few issues with ending here. First, I want to see a catapult used to destroy the fortifications, or at least attack them, not just kill the defenders. Second, the belly bow is a tension catapult. It just uses a bow arm. I want to see twists. I want to see a mechanized spring being used to hurl large stones great distances. This is what I think of when I think of a catapult. At this time, the belly bow only shot arrows, slightly larger arrows than an archer would shoot, but still arrows. Eventually, the belly bow would shoot stones. The stones wouldn't be very large, given the limited capacity of the bow arm. The idea of the catapult that we all think of wouldn't be used for at least 60 years to siege the island city of Tyre by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is a little bit of foreshadowing. We have to dial it back, but first, I want to give you a quote by him. Alexander the Great is quoted to have said, "The fortunes of war teaches its lessons, even to the vanquished." This quote means lessons are learned by the victor, and lessons are learned by the defeated. The Carthaginians surely learned their lesson after being destroyed by the catapults, but who we're going to be focusing on next is the Greeks. Dionysius had hired a lot of Greek mercenaries. Those Greek mercenaries were no longer needed, as he had conquered his island. They would have traveled home with word of the catapult in hand. Greece was in constant squabble with each other. They were fighting on who was the Greekiest. Eventually, this would boil over into a major conflict called the Third, yes, the Third, Sacred War. The Third Sacred War is a very complicated event, but at the end of it, Philip II of Macedon would have a majority control of Greece. I just wanted to put in a quick note about Philip II. If the Greek writer Strabo is to be believed, Philip II lost his eye to a catapult. Philip II was a genius when it came to warfare. He did lots of things to modernize the army, and this would result in him going undefeated for 6 years, until one general. This general's name is Anomarchus, and at the time, he led a neighboring state to Philip II. Anomarchus is only important one time in history, and it's for handing Philip II a big fat L. Anomarchus would lead Philip's troops into a valley, and on the lofty heights of the valley, he had catapults positioned. Now, these catapults could have been belly bows. They might have been torsion catapults at this point, but we're not sure. The interesting fact is, though, they flung stones instead of arrows. It's not specifically stated in the sources that they were using catapults, but it is said that Philip's troops were smashed to bits and pulverized by these stones. Now, I don't think slings are smashing troops to bits. It seems to me these stones would have been much larger. The fortune of war was taught to Philip after his defeat. And with these life lessons learned the hard way, Philip would use this information to build mechanized devices. Now, the story gets a little murky here. We have to pick and pull from sources that aren't necessarily in chronological order, nor do they have a definite date. There's only a range of dates that they could come from. The major lesson learned was the power of flinging stones instead of arrows. You see, an arrow hits a person and it stops. A stone can hit a person, bounce off them, roll over another person, and deal great damage. And now that generals were using stones in these catapults, this gets us one step closer to where we want to be. And don't be fooled, they wouldn't just pick up rocks off the ground. Oftentimes they would have these stones prefabricated in a nice round, consistent shape and consistent weight in order for accurate flinging. The next evolution to come from the catapult would be the limitation of the bow itself. Given the building practices and building materials of the time, bows could only be about 15 feet. This would put a limit on the power of the bow and how heavy of a projectile it could fling. In order to overcome this limit, torsion would have to be used. All that torsion really is a big spring. These ropes being twisted up allows them to store a ton of energy when they want to untwist. Stick an arm in it, and it'll fling anything you put on it. So to wrap up Anomarchus on his one important part of history, he could have used torsion catapults, but more than likely he was still using tension catapults. Across history, we see the pattern of humans reinventing the wheel, as we stated at the beginning. Whereas the belly bow was just an improvement on the bow and arrow, the torsion catapult was probably just an improved pole sling. All that the pole sling was a sling at the end of a pole, and you can see the limitation is clearly the person using the pole sling. This is the same limitation as the bow, the human factor. Philip II had learned his lesson about mechanized devices and would start implementing them in his army. And one of the few sources we have for this fact is a gravestone, of all things. On the gravestone, it said, Herolytus the Mysian, catapult discharger. This is interesting because it is the first documented case of an artilleryman in a military. Even though this man was a catapult discharger, we don't know when torsion catapults became commonplace on the battlefield. Also, the torsion catapult we think of only has one torsion system. That was a great limitation on power. So the next innovation would be the ballista, using 2 torsion systems, kind of in a crossbow formation. The earliest evidence we have of a ballista being built is another weird source. It is a stockroom, like receipt, if you want to call it that, of the supplies needed to build a ballista. This receipt is from 340 BC. And same thing as the belly bow. No one person is accredited for creating the torsion catapult. And because no one person is given credit, we give it to Philip II. He made the torsion catapult popular. Ironically enough, though, Philip II has no evidence of using a torsion system in a siege, as he didn't do many more military conquests after his defeat by Anomarchus. Another small scrap of evidence we have of a torsion catapult is from a poem. Now, I apologize in advance. This poem is a little confusing. It's probably because of the rough translation from ancient Greek to modern English, but nonetheless, it is a very interesting tidbit of history. This poem is from Menethimachus. I don't know how to say this name. It's going to be on screen. Do you realize that in us you'll have to fight? Men who at dinner make sharp swords their bite, and lighted links their sup, who when they've dined, at head on shield and coat of mail reclined, at foot on slings and bows, and duly crowned with catapults for wreaths have handed round, like nuts for anyone to take who likes, fine cretin darts of broken ends of pikes. Now, this poem just loosely means, are you really going to fight Philip II when our men eat swords for dinners, constantly wear their armor, and have catapults? Philip II would do a few more military conquests, but none of them are that important, and none of them are well documented. We don't know what he was doing at sieges. What is important, though, is Philip was getting busy. He was having kids, and one of those kids is the man, Alexander the Great. And here, we have finally made it to Alexander the Great. We only have 2 sieges to talk about with this man before we can wrap this story up. Alexander the Great was to inherit Philip's kingdom, and with it, his army, and with his army, the catapults. At the young age of 22 in 334 BC, Alexander the Great would have a siege. This is the siege of Halicarnassus. Here at this siege, Alexander the Great had torsion stone throwers mounted to siege towers. But still at this time, those stone throwers were used to attack the defenders and not their fortifications. Another disappointing letdown of the siege. When will we see stones used on the fortifications? Well, perhaps this is the siege where they finally learned the lesson. The prime theory is that some of the stones missed their mark and hit the wall, and the soldiers using the catapults saw the effect of stone hitting stone, crumbling it. The problem is these stones flung were for people. What if we flung a bigger stone? And here is where we get to the final siege that we're going to talk about. The siege of the island city of Tyre. It would be a short 2 years after the siege of Halicarnassus when Alexander the Great rolls up to Tyre. This time, packing large stone throwers. At the siege of Tyre, Alexander the Great would un-island Tyre to begin the siege. Yes, un-island Tyre. The coastline still isn't the same to this day after what this man did. At this point, Tyre had been so disrespected, they should have just given up right then and there. Getting rid of Tyre's island advantage would give Alexander the Great the advantage. During the un-islandification, Alexander the Great would have been flinging stones at Tyre. And here we get the quote that proves what we've been after all along, the use of siege weapons to destroy fortifications. Alexander mounted the stone thrower catapults in appropriate places and made the walls shake with the great rocks that they threw. With the sharpcasters on wooden towers, he kept up constant fire of all kinds and terribly punished the defenders on the walls. How cool is that? Made the walls shake with stones? Now, as cool as that is, Tyre would deploy a Looney Tunes tactic to stop this. They filled sacks with seaweed and dangled them over their walls to make cushions so that the stones would bounce off ineffectively. Yes, this actually worked and would be common practice in sieges. In a sad twist of fate, the tried and true battering ram would be what brought down the walls of Tyre and ended the siege, not the catapult. Kind of an anticlimactic ending, I know, but from then on, if a military could afford it and had the ability to do so, they would always use catapults at sieges on the fortifications of walled cities. Siege weapons would be so commonplace that Roman soldiers would write about stealing siege weapons used to defend villages so small they didn't even have a name. The fortunes of war had taught a lesson, and siege weapons were here to stay. Thank you for watching. That was a long one. If you made it to the end, I appreciate it. I love this story because it's the beginning of sieges, and the beginning of the weapons that I like to build. If you enjoyed the video, please consider sharing it. I don't really care about the likes and the comments. I just want people to see this and see if they like it. Leave feedback on how I can improve. Let me know what you think and maybe a story you want to hear. Thank you again. It really means a lot to me.